Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Welcome at this lecture, or actually talk, kind of. We've got two lecturers, and they're going to talk to each other. At the end, we can conclude that it's kind of a lecture. It's a talk, lecture. No.
It's a kitchen table talk.
A Christian?
Kitchen talk. That's how we call it.
Christian. No, sorry.
Not Christian.
Kitchen. A kitchen table talk, but with two interesting professors, scholars who've been, of course, studying the topic of tonight, which is the gender health gap. Sorry. You wonder if there is a gap between men and women, maybe, and what the gap is, and at least in how we look at it and how we look at it in our medical field, there is indeed a gap. And we've been learning about that the last couple of years more and more, and become aware of it. And you do wonder, why did we not hear more about it before? And why is this only an issue now, so it seems? Well, we've got two historians, or one historian and one, professor of health and humanities, who dived into the history of this, because, of course, how we look at this is cultural determined and has an historical background. And they already said during dinner that seemingly it is a hot topic at this point, but through the last decades, it's been on the table a couple of times. Still, the gap is still there. So you do wonder, what do we do with all the information? And also with this historical information. So we welcome Dr. Karen Hollewand, Assistant Professor of Cultural Heritage, Identity and Early Modern History at the University of Groningen, and Professor Rina Knoeff, Professor of Health and Humanities at the University of Groningen too. She studied and also worked here at Maastricht University, so welcome back. And you thought you'd bring your colleague, who is actually, you share a room, right? So this is like your daily situation. Nice flowers on the table, a cloth, kitchen table talk. That's what we call science and research. No. Thank you very much for coming all the way from Groningen, all the way to Maastricht, to talk about this important issue, the gender health gap. You will talk to each other, and we will form our thoughts during the first hour. And then, of course, there's room for some questions and discussion. Please welcome our speakers of tonight.
Thank you very much, Karen. This was yesterday, huh? When Harm came into our office.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, it was just mentioned. Rina and I share an office, and we actually wanted to replicate what we often do. Almost every time we're both in the office, we talk about the gender health gap together, and that's why we thought we would make a picture and take a picture and put it here, so you can see this is how we normally are in Groningen, and we're kind of recreating that format for you.
Apart from the fact that normally we have our backs to each other, so we get some work done, unless we turn around and chat about women and health and history, which is both of our topic, huh? Mm-hmm. So, Karen, what was your speciality again?
Yeah, so I study the history of sexuality, science, and the female body, mostly in the 17th and 18th centuries. And for Rina,
well, I'm working on the history of menopause at the moment. So I'm a professor of health and humanities, but that's sort of my job on the side. I'm a historian of medicine, for real. And the history of menopause is catching my attention at the moment. So that's what I'm doing.
So yeah, and actually Rina was talking about this topic in Ghent over the weekend. And that's where you took this picture. right?
No, this picture is actually taken at home because I was preparing it.
Okay.
And it was about the history of menopause, and it was actually in a theater. So there was a dancer from Iceland, and she was dancing and doing a show about menopause. And beforehand, they had a lecture, or they invited me to give a lecture on the history of menopause. So I was looking at my bookshelves, and I realized that I own an awful lot of popular science books on not only the menopause, but also on the gender health gap. So there is the book Invisible Women, you can see it on the lower row. That's very well known. Unwell Women next to it as well. And it's all about the gender health gap. Karen, maybe you should explain what it is.
The gender health gap, yes, so I think most of you coming here know what it is. It caught your eye, but really it's the gap between what we know about female bodies versus what we know about male bodies in medicine. And this is knowledge, but also a systematic, what we research, what we teach in education. Today we're here to talk more about history of how this all came to be, and a bit of nuance as well.
And just to come back to all the books, and we brought some books as well. I was in Germany not so very long ago, and this is what I found in the bookshop on the right, the picture. It was a whole table full of books on women's health. And it struck me really because I was in the same bookshop a few years earlier, and I asked for the section on women's health books, and I couldn't find it, and they had to look for it. And now they have a complete table full of it. So that just shows how popular the topic is at the moment. So we went to the bookshop today because we were a bit early here in Maastricht, and we went to the Dominicanenkerk, it is, I think. You don't have a shelf of books on women's health in Maastricht. We have it in Groningen, but we couldn't find it apart from...
Maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing, we don't know. Yeah.
We were speculating whether this was maybe Catholic or Catholic versus Protestant, but we won't go into that. What we did see was this book, and it's a very recent publication. It's published by Women Inc., and Women Inc. is of course very well known for publishing on the gender health gap and really bringing it to the attention. They are doing a really great job in doing that. And now they've brought out this book. So we bought it and we had a look at it. And Karen, I think you are more upset than I was.
Yes, we just found this today. So it's called Diagnosis Female, Woman. En then it says hoe het vrouwenlichaam werkt en waarom we dat nu pas ontdekken. So how the female body works and why we didn't know until now. Well, as a historian, that catches your eye because actually the female body has been studied a lot in history, and they actually knew a lot about the female body as well. And then we started looking at what they said about history, and that's when I got a little bit upset, but we can get into that more later maybe, because to know what's happening with the gender health gap and to look at all these books, we think as historians it's very important to talk about how we got here and to give you some historical perspectives on that gender health gap. Especially also because many of these books, there's a lot of anger in these books. And actually I got a bit angry today concerning this book.
But not about the patriarchy.
Not about the patriarchy, no. Which is not to say that we should not be angry about the patriarchy and that women have not been in a bad situation in history. There's a lot to be angry about. But what we often see in books about the gender health gap or about the history of women is that the finger is pointed at the patriarchy and at men. They are the big enemy. And we think there's more to say, right, Rina?
Yes. So we've done this kitchen table talk quite a few times already. And we also enjoy doing it because we know of each other's work and we think we have something important to say. Also because the debate is always about patriarchy and it's very much fits what they call in Germany the Wutsbürger, the citizen who is very angry about something and then goes and sort of speaks out. And in many of these books, people are very angry about patriarchy. And looking at history, we think that this is maybe not entirely justified, and we want to plead for a much more nuanced view, in particular if you look at history. So if you look at this book, the authors, they get very, very angry, in particular about pre-modern society. And pre-modern is everything before the French Revolution, everything before the 19th century. And it's always said, oh, this was very medieval, very dark, very stupid, and it was very patriarchal. And what we actually find, and we are both studying early modern history of medicine and history of health, is that the system was maybe much better for women in that time than it is now. And that actually the evil age was the 19th century, not before. But we will explain.
Yeah, so what we want to do this evening is really give you a bit of nuance there and talk about the different ideas about the female body, looking at 3 case studies. So really showing you how much more complicated it is than just pointing the finger. And that's also why it's so much more interesting, because there's so much more to say about history. So we'll first talk about menstruation and menopause, and then about hysteria and vage klachten, or vague symptoms. And then we're going to say a bit about pain at the end. And of course, there's lots of room for your questions and comments.
We put pain in capitals, because it's so important.
Yeah.
And we also put in the picture for a reason, because we believe in pictures. They're very important to us. So we look at historical sources, so that's written materials, but also pictures. Because pictures, they tell you a lot of stories and they give you a lot of historical insight. So what we see on this picture is Trein. She's the old woman, and she is suffering from all sorts of women's complaints, perhaps to do with menopause. And what you can see is that she's being bled at her foot. And it's not a normal sort of bloodletting with a knife, it's with cups. And you can see the cups in the next to the picture. So the idea is that you prick some holes in the skin, and then you put the glass above the candle. So you can see the candle standing here. Let me see where. Oh, here it is. Here's the candle. So you hold the glass above the flame, and it gets hot. And then you place it on the foot, on top of the holes in the skin. And the cup cools down, so it sucks to the skin, and it also sucks out the blood. And it's done in this particular place because that is where the mother vein is. And the mother vein runs from the womb to the foot. So if a woman is suffering from all sorts of complaints, very often the reason is that she is not menstruating enough, or she has a lot of blood inside her body that needs to get out. And of course you can do that via bleeding her mother vein. And this is a practice that lasted until very far into the 19th century. So that's why the picture is there, because as you will see, we will trace many of the female complaints back to this problem of menstruation.
Yep, so we'll start there, menstruation and menopause. So when you read about the history of menstruation, often you get a very negative story. So it's a story that menstruation was seen as the characteristic of the female body being imperfect and being weaker than the man. And menstruation made her weak, the blood was toxic, and she needed to get rid of this toxicity. We often see this very negative story. But when we look at the sources in history, we actually see that the negative is there, but there's also a more positive side of the story.
Maybe you can talk about the negative a bit more, because we see the flowers on the picture.
Yeah. So this, you might think, in the early modern period, this has nothing to do with modern times. But we see that this idea about toxicity of the menstrual blood, this remains important all the way up into the 20th century. And here we see an experiment done where this researcher has taken a flower and he's put one flower in, I think it's normal water, even normal blood, but I think it's water, and one flower into menstrual blood. And this would prove that menstrual blood was toxic because the flower died that was put into the menstrual blood.
It's also to do with this very strange story of the pediatrician in Germany. And he got a bunch of flowers someday, and the bunch of flowers was brought in by a servant girl, and he was very happy about it, and he put the flowers in a vase. And he came into his office the next day, and all the flowers had wilted. And so he was very puzzled about it, and he started asking around. And then he discovered that the servant girl was menstruating at the moment she was bringing in the flowers. And then the theory was, of course, that the menstrual blood was fuming or was giving up off bad vapors that kills the flowers, basically. Yeah. So this experiment is something that's referring back to that silly story, really.
Yeah, and we see these things about the menstrual blood, but also the menstrual woman being toxic everywhere throughout history, where, if a man would have sexual relations with a menstruating woman, the penis could fall off or could be even bitten off. It would ruin crops. It would do all kinds of things. But it's important because this is the negative story we often see in these
about
books.
The positive story.
But it's also the menstruation was also seen as a sign of health from the early age onwards. So if a woman was not menstruating, that was seen as she might be ill, she might not have a normal reproduction system. So really, menstruation was seen as something natural, something very good for a woman to have. Also because of the idea that the woman had a monthly cycle where the toxicity in her body was being removed by the blood.
But so men don't have toxicity in their bodies?
They do, but they have to get rid of it by bloodletting or also by male menstruation. This was also a phenomenon that we encountered in our research.
This is always a story that our students love, male menstruation. The female body was seen as the most perfect body there is because it had this perfect system of menstruation, this perfect system of detox. And of course, men didn't have it. They could get rid of the toxicity in their body by doing a lot of exercise and sweating a lot. But as soon as they were sitting down and not moving around enough, they were sort of keeping all this toxicity in their body and they needed to get rid of it. So bloodletting was a way, but very often they also had male menstruation. How did this work, you wonder? Everywhere. Via the penis it could happen, via finger. I came across a story of an Irish gentleman who bled every month from his little finger without leaving a scar, which was also very miraculous. But most often they bled from hemorrhoids. And the most famous patient or the most famous man who was bleeding from hemorrhoids was Louis XIV, Louis XIV of France. And he also got some problems with his male menstruation. So his hemorrhoids, they turned into abscesses and he needed a complicated operation. Anyway, this whole thing about male menstruation at the court of Louis XIV became so fashionable that all of his courtiers had male menstruation as well, and it became really a fashionable disease. So this is just an example that shows a completely different side of history, namely the perfection of the female body. And we very often forget about it because we only think about this story about toxicity of menstrual blood.
And the menstruation being, seen as a weak sign of the female body. Here, by the way, in the second image on the left, you also see in English, especially in the early modern period, but still today, menstruation could also be called flowers. So you had your flowers, and here we see it also in the image where there's a flower, where the vulva vagina is for the woman. So this was a direct reference to that. But then,
with the flowers, that Helen King is having another story. So Helen King, she wrote this very beautiful book. It came out very recently. And she said she's not too happy about this mentioning of flowers because she says if you talk about flowers, it implies that you pick them at a certain point when they are at their best. And after the best time, they just wilt and they are not worth very much anymore. So she tends to be critical about it.
And there's a sexual component, of course, the deflowering of the woman. But it's good to say flowers at least has some kind of positive sign to it. But then when we talk about when a woman doesn't have her flowers anymore, the menopause, you're writing a book about this. How does this factor into the story of the history of the female body?
Yes, menopause is also, of course, when you think about the positive model of menstruation and a woman getting rid of all the toxicity in her body, as soon as she gets into menopause, this stops. And presumably all the toxicity stays inside her body and makes her ill. So there was a lot of anxiety about menopause. until doctors showed up, and this is actually sort of a wave in history. Doctors show up and say, you should not be afraid of menopause because the body will readjust. It will just not produce as much fluids. It will not produce as much toxicity as before, and your body has to readjust. So it's a very natural process. But the doctor then, of course, also said, but it can be accompanied by over 50 diseases. And then he put himself forward as the best person to treat them. So he was a very good businessman, the doctor was, because of course menopausal women, very good for his purse. So how bad this period of transition could be, you can see on the picture on the right. This is from a surgeon's handbook. And you see the differences in diseases between men and women. So as you can see, the man is suffering from wounds a lot. So that fits the image of male bravery, going out, getting into fights and getting wounds. On the left, we see the woman, and she is suffering from tumors. She has tumors everywhere. So this is all this menstrual blood that stays inside the body and then turns toxic and starts to rot. So basically the woman is rotting from the inside out. So you can see here on the picture, she is having a tumor at her eye, breast tumor you can see in her belly. She actually also has a prolapsed womb. She has a tumor on her knee. And she has I always forget the English term for it, a spatader. Or an aderspot, a venous artery, is it, I think? Does that sound familiar, venous artery? It's one of the arteries that's sort of exploding. I always forget the English term for it. But anyway, so you see here, this woman, she's suffering from cancer. And cancer was seen as a feminine disease. It was seen as a female disease, and the worst cancer of all was breast cancer. And lots of women suffered from it in the past. It was very, very sad disease. On the left, you see again an image of a woman being bled from her foot, which is again the mother vein. So this is, when you see this with a woman or a woman being bled from her foot, this is always the case. And menopause, like I said, was always a wave. So women being very scared of it, doctors saying you shouldn't be scared of it because your body will balance itself out. But then coming up with a lot of medicalization to help her through the menopause. And this whole issue of medicalization, we will talk about it later.
But can you then say for menstruation there's a positive and a negative side, but for menopause it's mostly a negative thing for women? In this time
no, it's
in
not, because it also depends on the time. Because when you go to the 16th century, aging was seen in a very negative way. So then menopause, of course, is a sign of aging, and it was really looked upon with a lot of anxiety by women. But when you go to the 18th century, you see that aging is valued very positively. So you see also doctors' handbooks. They also always argue that old age is the best period in a person's life because you're freed of the passions and you can enjoy life. So life is worth preserving. And you then see also that doctors treat the menopause in a much more positive way. Also because the medical system is more positive towards it. So the model of menstruation, they leave it behind and they focus on the womb. And they say the womb gets less irritated. And it gets less, it upsets the body less than before. So it also depends on how culturally constructed the menopause is and what age you're talking about.
Yeah, so at least we can say for the menopause there's a lot of attention paid to it in all times,
yes.
In all cultures. So you already talked about the womb, about the uterus, and I think that's also kind of central in our second case study when we talk about hysteria and vague complaints. Vague,
yes.
Yeah, when we don't know what's going on with a woman. People often pointed at the womb and said the womb was the problem.
Have you read the Green Book on Hysteria?
I've not. Well, you had a chance to look at it yet, but what is it? Let's see what it says on.
Well, it points
Hysteria.
back at early modern times, and
it
points back at Hippocrates, and it's completely mistaken. So The time that hysteria really was important and was an important complaint was the 19th century, not before. It was the 19th century.
But we see things like that before the 19th century, of course, where women are, where they have, you know, there is some kind of thing. They point at the uterus, saying that maybe a woman has, when she can't let the blood out, she's not menstruating well, or there's something wrong with her. So the uterus was sometimes seen as an issue. Right, also before 1800.
It was more menstruation, I think. Mm-hmm. It was all about melancholy and depression. Of course, these complaints women had before. Mm-hmm. But it was seen in a different light, and it was in the 19th century that hysteria was very clearly connected to the womb, and later also to the ovaries. In order to explain, I think we have to go to what we now call the 19th century as the age of sensibility. And you all know it because of the film and the book by Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility. Who knows the book? Or the film?
It's film older now.
Almost everybody. So you remember, huh? So there are two sisters. The one sister, Eleanor, she has a lot of sense. And the other sister, Marianne, she's a little bit silly, and she has a lot of sensitivity. And
also connected to age, right? Because Eleanor is a bit older than
exactly.
Marianne.
Yeah. But Marianne, she always makes the wrong decision. So sensibility it started at the end of the 18th century, and the 19th century is the age of sensibility. What is it exactly? I'm going to read, because Dennis Diderot, who was an author of the Encyclopédie, the big Enlightenment project in the 18th century, his friend Sophie Volant asked him in 1760 what actually is sensibility. And Diderot answered, sensibility is the vivid effect on our soul of an infinity of delicate observations. So sensitivity or sensibility is a sort of emotional movement in response to a physical sensation. So something comes in from the outside, and your whole body gets into a turmoil. And that's what you can also see on the picture on the right. That's emblematic for sensibility. And you see the woman, she's touching a plant. And maybe you recognize the plant. It's a mimosa, in Dutch, kruidje roer me niet. It's a plant you very often see in garden centers. If you touch the leaf, you can see it on the picture, it starts to shrink. Huh? So it reacts immediately to your touch. So that is sort of the image of sensitivity. And it's interesting because there is also a verse underneath the picture, and it says, it expresses this very well, I think. It says, the leaves, as conscious of their queen's command, successive fall at her approaching hands, while her soft breast with pity seems to pant, and shrink at every shrinking of the plant. So whatever is happening to the plant when she's reaching with her hand is also happening inside her body. So it's that kind of sensitivity that is happening there.
Yeah, and important, of course, say when we go from the pre-modern periods to the 19th century, we go for more focus on the humors, the fluids in the body. So that's black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Blood is very important to a bit of a different idea on the body, right? And what you see here, this gets a bit technical, don't worry, but the system of the body is explained differently. And that explains also why the uterus and hysteria becomes more prominent, right?
So I'll explain it to you. There is two nervous systems in the body, according to 19th century physiologists. We sort of have the same thing now, but it's different. So we have the cerebral and spinal system, which is all voluntary. So it's the mind, it's thinking, it's feeling, it's will. It's all, you have it all under control. It's sense perception, so the things coming in, and it's voluntary motion. So you can control it all yourself. Then there is also the ganglionic nervous system. And that was introduced by Dr. Davy in the 1950s. And it's based on the idea that we have points in our body where a lot of nerves come together. But these ganglions, or these points, they connect to other points in the body. So everything actually in the body connects. And this ganglionic nervous system is maybe a little bit like the autonomous nervous system now, but it is all involuntary. So it functions independent from the mind. It's all about the vital and organic functions. Some of the organs are very important to it. It's mostly the organs we can't control ourselves. And Dr. Davy, he calls he mentions the stomach and the liver, but also the ovaries and the uterus. And it means that every upset in the uterus and the ovaries can upset the brain as well, because there are all these ganglions in the body. And the thing is also that the ganglionic nervous system always has precedence over the cerebral and spinal system. So if the uterus gets upset, or if it gets very much irritated, or the sensitivity is getting too much, it always takes precedence over anything you might think in your brain, because it's always more important. So what do you get? And I've written it down as well. If the uterus or the ovaries are upset or very irritated, you can suffer from, it's a long list, distressing headaches, fretfulness, peevishness, and capriciousness or bad temper. You can have temporary perversions of moral feeling and moral insanity. So it's all about morality as well, and the social functioning of a woman. A woman can get very criminal about it as well. So I've read stories about women getting in menopause. And of course they get a very upset womb, or the ovaries don't work so well anymore, and they start to steal. And the kind of things they steal is beautiful things. So they go to steal jewelry mostly. Why? Because they're losing beauty in their body and they need to find beauty somewhere else. So that is why they start stealing jewelry.
According, of course, to...
According to the doctor, and it was published in het Nederlands tijdschrift voor geneeskunde, so the Dutch Journal for Medicine. So this is the top-ranking journal in the Netherlands.
So this is how we go to hysteria, of course. I think we all know the term, where the woman becomes hysterisch, hysteria, when she kind of loses her mind in all kinds of forms. But also to these vague complaints, deze vage klachten, that if you don't know what's going on, or maybe the womb is upset and is taking over a woman's mind, is taking over her voluntary actions, the womb, and it's not explained, but this is why it can have so many different symptoms, right? Because we don't know what the uterus is doing exactly. Yes. And this is also something to do with the place of the uterus in the body, where we can't see it. We don't really know what's happening there. Yes,
well, that is also very old, I think, very old pattern of thinking. Huh? So the uterus is something unknown, in particular to men, because they don't feel it. And in the very old days, everything was about patriarchy. Here is the term again. And it was about heritage and lines of heritage. And but the problem was that the man could never be certain that the child inside the womb was his child. The only person who could know was the woman. So there was always this sort of uncertainty about the womb. But this is nothing to do with the 19th century anymore. Yeah. So what you see in the 19th century, and I will come back to this system again. So what do you do if you get crazy, if you're completely hysterical, if a woman is suffering from craziness? Several things you could do. Many women ended up in mental hospitals, so full of crazy women. But sometimes, or maybe more often than we think, women were operated on. And this is a very sad story, which is very much forgotten. And it's a 19th century story, and it is really born out of extreme medicalization. It's born out of gynecology as a discipline establishing itself, and practicing the trade on all of these women. So
here we're talking about when a woman is doing involuntary things, she's hysterical, that they say, okay, maybe you should remove the uterus or the ovaries.
So here's Dr. Davy again in the quotes, and he says, if either one of these organs of viscera, just names, were removed from the influence of the ganglionic nerves, and in particular, of course, the ovaries and the uterus, because you can't take away the stomach or the liver, if you remove it, its specific vitality must cease. So what happened in the 19th century is that ovariotomy was practiced quite a lot. So the ovaries were taken out by women who were suffering from mental derangement, so-called. But sometimes it also was women who were not behaving themselves according to the norms. and they were called crazy. And not only ovaries were removed, but also wombs. We have also clitoridectomies. So if you think that a female circumcision is something that happened very far away, no, it happened until very far in the 19th century in our own country. Lobotomy, that is something we are discovering at the moment, that quite a few women also underwent surgery where part of their brain was taken out because it was not functioning. So this is what medicalization also brought to the table, and it is very often forgotten.
Mm-hmm. And then we talk about pain as well, because I can imagine in the 19th century this was very painful, these kind of operations.
It was. Very often, in particular in the beginning, the ovariotomies, they were done without any anesthetic. So you can imagine the pain and the suffering that the women were undergoing here.
Yeah.
Of course, we had these doctors doing these horrendous operations, but we also had movements against it. So we had also women doctors who were standing up to it, establishing their own hospitals, and practicing medicine on a more holistic basis. And we also had satirical images. We had people making fun of all these cutting doctors, so they were criticized. And this is an image. It's from the early 20th century. It's a caricature, and it was given out actually to all the medical students who graduated from the Paris Medical School. And what you can see here is, of course, the woman on the table. It's almost like a party, huh? So, and it's the doctors with their specialties.
She looks very happy because, of course, she's.
And you see the gramophones and the sort of the playing of music at the bottom. Completely at the left, there is the gynecologist who invented hysterectomy, and he has a womb in his hand. And the womb is taken out by a myoma screw. This was the instrument he invented to take out the womb. And it is like a corkscrew. And it almost sort of mirrors the champagne bottles on the other side of the image. So it's very much a caricature. But then the funny thing is the image that is down below. Maybe you can point it out. You can see there. It's a naked woman, and she is outrunning the doctor. The doctor, it's actually a skeleton dressed up like a surgeon, and the woman is outrunning him. And we have more pictures like that. There are more plates, and always there is a little image in there, and you have to look very carefully, and it's always very funny. So you see on the one picture, it's like a petri dish. And in the petri dish, we see a 20s flapper girl, and flapper girl of the 1920s. They were supposedly having very loose morals. Well, she is laughing at the doctor, of course, who is looking at her. And then down below, we have a speculum, and the speculum is chasing Father Time. And it's all sort of making fun of these horrendous doctors. So yes, we have these doctors and we have these horrible operations, but we also have critical people being very critical about these operations.
Yeah. And as we already said, it's also very much about pain, which is our last case study, which we will turn to now. So really, with pain, I think this is also a very thing that has been in the news, or at least has been a topic of conversation in the medical world, but also broader about pain and how this is influenced by a class and by race. And really what we see is pain. Pain is not just pain. Pain is always often connected to biology. And here we also see how this connects back to the 19th century, where when we look at whether we talk about gender or sex or class or race, how you experience pain was thought to be different depending on your race or your class or your sex. We see this coming up in the 19th century, where bodies are understood in different ways depending on your race. And here we see, for example, with black women in the 19th century, and we still see the legacy of that today, where the idea was that they would experience pain less, they were less sensitive to pain, and therefore didn't need pain medications or could undergo the most horrible experiments because they experienced pain differently.
Yeah.
And this is still, and the same with class. We see this, for example, as well with when we go through menstruation pain or with menopause or with pregnancy, where working class women were very much experiencing pain differently, was thought, than elite women. Also, when you go to hysteria or these kinds of operations, it really, not only your sex mattered, but also it was very intersectional. So also what class you were, what race you were, based on that, your biology was thought to be very different, and therefore you handled pain differently. And we still see the legacy of that today.
Yes, I think it's important to really realize that this whole idea that biology is at the basis of being a woman or being black or being of a lower class, that is really something from the 19th century, not before. And we see then also that in the 19th century there is a quite strict dichotomy, don't you think so, Karen, between men and women? That is not something we saw before. So if you go to pre-modern times, doctors, they thought quite non-binary, actually. That might surprise you, but I've come across surgeons who distinguished 4 sexes, and other doctors that said, look, there is just a horizontal spectrum, a scale, with a very feminine woman on the one side and a very masculine man on the other side. And every real person is somewhere in between, having male and female characteristic. Hence, of course, we have male menstruation. That is entirely possible if you think in terms of a spectrum. And this kind, I find that totally fascinating, because this kind of spectrum thinking is so modern. And we already see it in the Middle Ages. Which is totally surprising.
Yeah, and you have an example of that, actually, which you came across in your research. And this is Paré. This is around 1600? Or
yes, this is the 16th century. And this is in a surgeon's handbook. And this actually is a decision model for surgeons. What should you do in which situation? And here it says the decision model is on what you should look for and what you should take care of. So in treating a patient, at the top it says, and I can't read it exactly because it's too far away.
Sterkte des patiënts. So
it's about the strength or the fortitude of the patient, which is very important to take into account, because if your patient cannot deal with the pain you're about to inflict, and you must remember that these surgeons, they were always operating without anesthetic. If you can see that the patient will not be able to stand the pain, you should not do it, because you will achieve the opposite of it. Your patient will most probably die. So that's completely at the top. And then we go a little bit down, and then we see van de sekse, about sex, which is important. And then it says, written behind it, because a woman, she cannot stand as strong a remedy as a male body. Which is something that we really ask for today, that we have this kind of acknowledgement, and we have it here already in the 16th century. By the way, this is not the comparison between men and women, and the fact that women cannot stand as much pain as male bodies is purely physical in this surgical textbook. It's nothing to do with what she has between her ears. It's purely because the woman is the weak flesh, and weak flesh is not because it's between the ears, it's because her flesh is more humid and it is more flabby, it's just more susceptible to pain. So it's purely physical. And these kinds of remarks, which we find in these very early surgical textbooks, they show a completely opposite view of what was actually happening in history. And I think, and we sort of both came to the conclusion that if we look at the history, we should not only look at the books of doctors who studied at university and who had very theoretical opinions about men and women, but we should look at the books of surgeons and the books of midwives, because they were treating real patients. They were dealing with pain. So if you want to know about it, you should look at their experiences, and not maybe at the doctors.
Yeah. And it also gives you a bit of an insight in our work. So we look at the images, but we also look at a lot at texts, and we try to read them sometimes against the grain. So we're not looking here for what they get wrong about the body, what medication they might be advising that we wouldn't now, but we really look at that cultural and historical context. So what does this tell us about gender? What does this tell us about ideas about the female body versus the male? This is one of the ways that we find our material.
We should talk about the equality paradox, because that's one of our topics.
So when we talk about the gender health gap, when we talk about the history of that, we also always mention the so-called equality paradox. And here really, this is about, okay, we have that gender health gap. Today we wanted to give you historical perspective on that, but also, of course, we want to bring up the question, how do we solve the gender health gap, and what can we learn from history to solve it? And what we then find very important to point out is the so-called equality paradox. And this is really the role of feminism, the historical role of feminism and the role of feminism today when we look at women in society. Because what we see, and here we have the example of course, an important feminist, Aletta Jacobs, what we really see with late 19th century feminism, but also with second wave feminism and throughout feminism, is really that the ideal was always to be just as good as the man. So we want to be taken just as seriously as men. And we see in this waves of feminism really that men and women are treated as equal. That's what we want. We want to see them as equal. And thus we don't want to be put in a separate box as women. We want to be put in the same box. And that's how we are going to be taken seriously in the world. And we want to have that same standard as men. But what we then see, if we focus on men and women together and we don't want to be put separately, is that we lose where women are different and where the female body is different. And there we see there's not research on female bodies separate from men, because we want to be taken in the same category as men. So we see there that the paradox of that feminism, that side of feminism at that time, and sometimes still today, has a different side to it.
Yes, and Aletta Jacobs is of course a perfect example, because she was growing up in this time when people thought that the uterus and the ovaries, they were upsetting the whole of the female body. And that's why women, they shouldn't go to theater, and they shouldn't read complicated stuff, or they shouldn't involve themselves in all sorts of erotic fantasies, because it would upset their brains. So and all the energy they would put into studying wouldn't go to menstruation. So women were very much advised not to study. And of course she was against that, and she wanted to study, and she managed, and that is all brilliant. And then she published this book, and it's a very interesting book because it was for a broader audience. It was for all the women she was treating, also from the lower social classes, because she wanted these women to learn about their own bodies. And it's an interesting book because there's these flaps, and you can open it, and you can, as it were, sort of move inside the body by opening these flaps. But in the introduction she said, listen people, the body or female organs are exactly the same. They might look differently, but their function is exactly the same. So she is really stressing this point that a woman and a man in their bodies are exactly the same, which I can understand from her point of view. But if you then sort of start believing this, and you can also lose sight of the fact that the female body is different in many aspects. But that doesn't mean that she's worth less than a man, but she is different. And that is exactly the paradox that we are facing today, and that we need to come to terms with. So we need to find a way where we can think about the equality of men and women and everything in between. Because it's not only about men and women, this is all far too simple. But we should acknowledge that bodies are different. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is very much our lesson. And we asked you, also, do we have the...
Oh, it's there. We asked you a question beforehand because we were very curious to see... hold it up.
You know, we are very happy to have so many men in the
We normally don't get men on our lectures, so that's why we put men in a separate category, and then we already were like critical of ourselves, being like, we've put you into two categories, men and women, and maybe that wasn't the best idea because some people don't identify as male or female. But so for that, we should, you know, this was kind of a last-minute thing. But this is interesting to see, because the question was, Rina, you formulated the question: where should the money go? What should be more focused?
So
right?
we have menstruation, menopause. These are sort of the acknowledged female problems that we very often also want to sort of give our money and funding to. Our government now is getting aware, or is sort of aware of the gender health gap, and it has decided to invest money. And what we can see is that the Society for Gynecology and Obstetrics is already claiming the pot of money and dividing it already before it's even out there, which you might be critical about after learning about our historical story, because they will probably medicalize. And is medicalization really what we want? Or do we want to look at the healthcare system, which is about the question of when a woman goes to the GP, will she get referred to the specialist, or as research suggests, that men or male patients, they get referred to the specialist sooner than female patients. So I'm quite happy to see that quite a few of you think that the healthcare system should be tackled here. And of course we also have the brain and the heart, and I'm not actually sure whether we should have a lot of money going there, because what do you think, Karen?
Well, everything deserves money, let's on here, of course. But for me, I think the healthcare system is very important there, also from a historical point of view. But this could also be a first topic of to hear what people chose and to hear why and why they think that's important, and maybe we can put a bit more context there.
If you see here, then we have a lot of young people in the room. As we can see as well, of course. And most of the young people, they go for the menstruation, and also the, interestingly enough, also, and also for the healthcare system. And most of the men, they also go for the healthcare system, which is an interesting choice.
Yeah, very good. We can discuss that more.
I think we should open the floor to questions.
Yes. And thank you for your attention.
So, questions, or should we start with asking who voted for what and why? But maybe there's already a question for...
You can also ask other questions, that's fine.
Anybody who wants to elaborate on their choice, for instance, on the brain and heart? Is there somebody who says, yeah, if there's funding, this is indeed an important issue. Why did you choose brain and heart? I mean, everything is important, but why that's the most important, you think? Or what's your insight? Yes.
Thank you. It's actually not a question, but I chose brain and heart because there has been a clear gender health gap in that, because a lot of women risk of dying of heart attack more than men, because doctors are not able to diagnose ischemic heart attack or strokes or any kind of symptoms caused by blood circulation in women. So I think it's important to do research on that, but to connect it to the other topic, I don't think that would be my most urgent priority as a healthcare professional. I think most of the problems are addressed towards menopause and menstruation. There is clearly lack of research on that, and a lot of women, especially in reproductive age, they are not able to have significant therapies regarding gynecological diseases, and is affecting their whole life. While brain and heart mostly is the later stage of life, which is still important, but by focusing on menstruation and menopause, we might help more people, I think.
That's a very sensible explanation. Huh? So, of course, these are the acknowledged female problems. It's also reducing female health to the reproductive organs, and which is fine. We need more research on this, but we sometimes also talk about this, because that's what people have done in the past a lot, reducing women to their reproductive organs. First it was the womb, then the ovaries, and now it's very much hormones. So we even have these courses you can go to. Know your hormones, and you know when to act in your company. And these
know your cycle, yeah, which you're tracking your cycle with your app, and that will. Not that these are bad things. I have them on my phone as well, and it's sometimes nice to know where you are in your cycle. But that explains everything in your life. If you want to be successful, plan your calendar around your cycle. Well, of course, a woman is much more than her hormones. We see that coming back. But yeah, we have the two special women issues there, and then we have the more general things over there. Yeah.
And it's, of course, when you talk about the brain and the heart, we have all this heart research already, and it's an established fact that the female heart works differently from the male heart. The brain is a different matter, because there is a lot of debate on the question of whether we have something called a female brain. Mm-hmm. I think science hasn't decided yet. Mm-hmm. Although sometimes people argue, or scientists argue, that we should treat women's psychological problems differently because of their brain. But I think that is not decided yet, that issue.
And of course, the problem is that you go really to the binary again, where you say it's either a female brain or a male brain, or it's a female heart or a male heart, or it's a female, that you say it's either a male organ or a female organ. Well, of course, we know that we're all kind of on a spectrum when it comes to hormones, or it comes to chromosomes, or on that way. So it also puts us into, if you're a woman, then you should go to that doctor, when a male, you go to that institute. Or so yeah, there's a question if that's helpful to women as well.
So something I come across in my menopause research, and we actually have a PhD student working on it at the moment, is the question of anxiety brought about by doing medical research and by writing all these books on menopause you can buy in the shop. I don't know if you've ever read one of these books. I have a lot of them on my shelf because I'm working on it. I've never finished one of them because they are so depressing. All the kinds of diseases you can get once you get past a certain age. And we believe, and this PhD student is looking at it, through looking at lifelines. This is a cohort study, and we are asking women of all ages, what do these books do to you? Do you fear the menopause more after reading what you can get from it? And how do you look at it afterwards? Was it all much better than you expected or not? So we really are very interested in these women of 70 and 80 years old, and see what they think about menopause. So that's the backside of medicalization, and of being very aware of all the complaints and all the trouble you can get.
We'll just keep talking if you don't stop us. So please ask a question.
There's a question.
Do you ever get it the other way around? Because at the end, women get older than men, so men are less healthy.
Yes, well, Women Inc.
So we can look at the accent on health and the female body, but what's with the male body? Because we don't get that.
I think if you ask these women, they always say women get sicker, men die quicker, but women get sicker. So in terms of healthy years, men have more healthy years, even though they die earlier. And women, they have many more unhealthy years, or years where they are suffering from all sorts of complaints.
But you're saying they are saying this is a fact?
This is what they claim. And this is one of their big, when you open their website, this is almost the first thing you see.
Okay, what do you think about it? There's some truth in it, right? Or?
I think there's truth in it, yes. I don't know, if you ask me the question, what would you prefer? Die earlier but be healthy until you die, or have a lot of miserable years but live a little bit longer in misery? I don't know. What would you do?
I was thinking about that compartments, because I think what is needed actually is a research that creates connections between them. And because it's not that the female organs or the female body, it's just divided in compartments. For example, there is a very interesting research by a researcher, she is a professor in the US, Emily Jacobson. She is a endocrinologist. So she looks how feminine hormones have an effect on the brain, which is a connection between feminine organs and hormones and a brain that they are not separated. And because the feminine hormones can have an effect on the brain probably works differently, or, for example, the effects it can have in Alzheimer, that apparently the incidence of Alzheimer is larger in women than in the after menopause. So that may have a reason. The reason behind could be the hormones, the feminine organs. They haven't discovered yet that, but they are researching that. So what I was thinking is it better to think, or it's better to invest in heart and brain, or in menopause? I think you need more collaboration and interconnectedness between the researchers.
This is the call for interdisciplinarity.
Yes,
we are very much in favor of it.
And then also the humanities want to be involved, because we sometimes get left behind, where it's all about medical research and having more data, but then the data is not, people are not reaching each other, or they're not reaching the patients, or people are not susceptible to certain information. For example, this is a bit of a random, but why is there not a pill for men yet, anticonceptive pill for men? Because culturally, men don't want to take it. It could have been produced 20 years ago. So it's a cultural explanation. It's not a medical explanation or a chemical explanation why there's no anticonceptive pill for men. It's a cultural thing. And this is, I think, historians and cultural researchers need to be involved there. But I agree with you, there should be more connection between all of these things. And first and foremost, let me just be clear, we are not against more research going to women's issues, because we need first all of that information, and we need much more research before we can even connect all these things together and know enough about the female heart and the male heart to say we can have one heart place where you go when you have heart problems for men and women, for sure. But then it's all connected, of course. You cannot just isolate the menopause or isolate the menstrual problems from how the whole body works. So yeah, it's very important.
It is an interesting notice to when I listen to your argument, it's a little bit 19th century. Huh? So in the 19th century, the ganglionic nervous system, that was almost arguing in the same vein. Huh? So everything is connected, and if something happens in the womb, it affects the brain, and vice versa. And the woman, she suffers from mental derangement or whatever. It's not as bad now. But nowadays we are living in this system of, or the medical system of hormones, and we don't blame the uterus anymore, but we blame the hormones. But it's a very similar sort of pattern that we are following.
I saw a question somewhere there, yeah.
Yes. Adding to what you said now, isn't there also a paradox in we need the medicalization in a way to get further and acknowledge the differences between female and male bodies? And on the other hand, you said the medicalization made things worse.
Yes, in the 19th century this was the case. It was not good necessarily for women, because of all these crazy doctors doing all these horrible operations. This is also what we see with menopause. Medicalization is a good thing because we get to know about the female body, but on the other hand, we also increase anxiety about it. And so we need to find a balance, and we need to be very careful. I think that's maybe the lesson of this exercise. If we spend money on research, we need to be very careful on what we spend it on.
Yeah, I find it very interesting to learn that actually, there's so many parts to female health. Like I didn't think of that when I came here. I was like mostly focused on hormones as well. I'm just wondering, like, firstly, like, where do we stand generally now if you compare men's health on different parts compared to women's health, like percentage-wise, like how far do we still have to go? Like today, where do we stand, generally speaking? And also the difference between, the gap, like what is the cause, would you say? Personally, I can also imagine, like, if you don't have enough money, where do you start? You gotta start somewhere. Okay, so we start with the male body because it seems more simple. Like, and then when we have enough money, we'll start with the other gender as well at some point. Like, it could be just purely logical because there's not enough money to do both at the same time. But, or is there also really like this agenda behind it? Like, it's just, I guess you're kind of suggesting that as well. Like, women are not important, maybe like culture-wise, but like, So what causes the gap and how big is it currently today?
The gap's really big still. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers here today, but I think still a couple of years ago where there's six times more research on erectile dysfunction than there is on PMS, for example. Menstrual blood, I think when you look at blood, research on blood in general, there's like, I don't remember the times, but there's also 100 times more research than on menstrual blood. And this all really goes back to money. So what really the big, when you have the funding organizations deciding where research money goes, we see that generally, when we look at research on the heart or research on the brain, that's seen as everybody deals with those issues. But PMS, menstruation, menopause, that's a special category because only women deal with those issues. So less money should go there because that's a special group. So it's not taken into account as everyone benefits from research, and it's a special category. So less money goes there. And what's important here is that we often also get the comment of, but more women are going into those funding agencies, more women are going to be deciding about the money, so more money will go to female issues. But this is not the case. Because when you identify as a woman, you're not automatically a feminist. And also the system is kind of working against you. So to get in one of those funding agencies or to get a spot at the table, you might already be not voting for those issues because you're still in the system that's kind of going against women and women's health issues. So saying, okay, 50% of the women at the table, 50% of the people at the table are female or identify as female, or doesn't mean that they will vote for the money to go to female issues. So we need more activism there, and really understanding that the system will not change automatically with more women being at the top if they reach the top. So the gap is really still very large, and it won't change automatically if we just wait and say, okay, there's feminism now, there's more women being educated, more women going to the top, it will change. No, we need to really and also know how long, of course, it's thousands of years of not women being under-researched, because there is research, but there's not the attention to research and to the female body as there should be. So yeah, that was my activist statement.
The saddest example of how big the gap is that a Canadian medical scientist discovered that Viagra works really well against PMS. And he filed in a research application to do research because he discovered this in doing a very small test. So he wanted to make a big test. And he never got his research funded. Because Viagra is male medication, isn't it? And it's not meant for women, it's meant for men.
Yeah. And PMS is not a sexy thing to market, and erectile dysfunction or a sexy topic is more. So it's also pharmaceutical companies that play a huge role in medication and getting medication to the market.
And meanwhile, we are also forgetting that the gender health gap is also very bad for men.
Yes.
Because men are suffering also a lot from osteoporosis, for instance. But it's now, we think that this is mainly women past menopause who have osteoporosis, but this is not the case. So we have insufficient attention for female diseases in male bodies, which also happen, of course. So that is also the other side of the gender health gap.
Thank you. It was a really, really interesting discussion. I was kind of curious, where do you think culturally we are now in terms of attitudes on this topic? Are we closer to the 19th century horror shows or to the stuff that you said that came before that was less horrible?
I mean, 5 years ago or even 2 years ago, I would have said, I think we're heading in the right direction. And now with what's happening in the United States and everything, I'm getting very worried that we are, I don't know, it's difficult. Yeah.
I think one of the examples of this book, it shows that we are maybe closer to the 19th century still, because we very much look towards medicine to solve the trouble. Whereas a lot of the trouble is also cultural, and it's also attitudes that are out there in society. So if it's about funding, we should have another category here. and include more sort of cultural research. How do we actually look at female bodies? What do they mean in today's society? Are we still considering them as in a sort of domestic roles or not? I think we need better research on that, and also see how this sort of translates into research on the female body, because there are still a lot of these prejudices hanging around in the medical sciences. And like Karen was just saying, this is a system that we are still in, that is still very much 19th century, and medicalization is very much the answer to every problem. Whereas maybe we should also take a step back and reflect. And so that's why we also usually talk a lot about pre-modern times, because we normally think that they were completely stupid in pre-modern times, but they actually were operating a model that was maybe better or
holistic
suits.
Yeah.
That doesn't say that I would like to live in the 16th century, because I don't. I'm very happy to live in today's day and age.
Yeah, but also I think what's interesting here in this, I mean, I get to, in the back of this book, we're not bashing this book, it's just a great example of what we talk about. It has in the end, it has a chapter on what can you do as a female yourself, and then it tells you what questions to ask at the doctor, and that you can always take someone with you, and it's very important, but it puts again the responsibility on the woman and not on the system. So it tells you, you as a woman should prepare yourself when you do this, you should ask for this and do that, instead of saying doctors should be educated better, the system should change. It's not always the women themselves. They're important in that, but again, we should have a more systematic change there and educate doctors differently, because again, female doctors are also educated in the same system that doesn't have enough attention to menopause. I think you get like 2 hours or 5 hours on menopause in your whole medical career or something. It's very low. So the system needs to change for everyone, also the doctors and everyone outside, to get a better education in that as well. So I think it is not going backwards. I don't think we're in a worse situation than we were 100, 200 years ago, but it does need attention and actual action to change things.
Is it an issue and on the agenda in medical education nowadays?
There is attention. I'm not sure about medical education. Maybe we should ask medical students.
Medical students here? It is, yes? Yeah, definitely. Good. Yeah.
Thank you both so much for very interesting insights. You mentioned that it's important to look at cultural factors as well. And with regards to that, I was wondering whether you think it's useful to differentiate between sex and gender when trying to understand these health discrepancies between men and women. And also whether historically this distinction has been made. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I remember once we were in a podcast together with the biology students. Oh, yes. And then we suggested to him, they're thinking in two sexes, the binary model is just what we came up with as a culture that works to understand the body. But we could think of 3 sexes and 4 sexes and 5 genders and 6 genders. And you saw, he just became pale. He just like, who are these women? What are these suggestions? But in a way, of course, it's helpful to think about. I think gender is important. It's an important thing connected to sex, but then it's been very binary, and this has kind of been a cultural decision in science as well. When chromosomes were discovered, when hormones were discovered, it was a cultural decision to label those male and female, for example. And I think we should look at that and look at the cultural impact there, the historical impact of, okay, what does that mean if we keep that binary model? What if we just, look at individuals instead of your male or female? And also, you're always more than male or female, whether that's sex or gender related. You come from a certain background, you live in a certain culture, you live in a certain time, you live in a certain social group, you have a certain age. So there's more to the individual than the sex and the gender. And whether that has to be binary, it has brought good things and bad things, I would say.
I think we should get rid of the whole distinction between sex and gender.
Well, yeah, that's another thing. Yeah.
Because the explanation is always that sex is biological and gender is cultural. But also sex is very cultural. And the way we look at sexes and the way we define biology, it's always cultural. And that is what we have seen in our historical work. For instance, if you look at the 19th century and these theories about the ganglionic nervous system, that's very biological, but it's all so gendered because it's all about the female body in a domestic role and the morality of the female. Well, when was morality ever biological? Huh? So, and still this would count as sex or biological. So I'm not sure whether this is a very useful distinction. I think in pre-modern times the distinction between sex and gender was not there. This is a very recent construction.
Thank you for the interesting talk. What occurred to me is that at the start of the talk it was mentioned that the female body was actually celebrated through the history and that is a point we should focus more on. But afterwards, for almost an hour, we heard about all the terrible things happening to the female body. And I was actually wondering, how are we supposed to focus on all the good things that happened to women in history and are still occurring now, when we just heard about all the bad things happening to us?
Good question. I hope we have a bit of balance in there between the good and the bad. Yeah, Rina, how can we?
Well, I think what we wanted to show is that the female body was looked at in a much more positive way in pre-modern times and in modern times, and that when things started getting pear-shaped, it happened very recently. And this whole patriarchal model that we are so angry about is not millennia old. It's actually started in the 19th century. It's quite recent, and it's very much rooted in modern medicine, the medicine that we are still having in our hospitals. And if we don't acknowledge that this patriarchal, horrible system is at the root of our own medicine, we will never be able to solve it. So that is why we made the big contrast between before and in the dark medieval times. And that is why we wanted to point to the fact that the female body was actually seen as the perfect model of a healthy physiology, because it had this perfect balance of keeping the humors in balance and the fluids in balance and getting toxicity out. I think that is very much the message, that we should acknowledge that. So it's always we always want to push ourselves forward, of course, as historians, to say, like, look, history is important. It is important to see where our views in medicine come from and where the gender health gap comes from, and we should not sort of stick to this unreasonable anger that we have, and because the anger is based on a very false historical picture, and if we don't acknowledge that, we will never solve the problem.
Thank you so much for the talk. My question is, have you encountered anything about postnatal depression or pregnancy in general from a historical perspective in your research?
About pregnancy and?
Postnatal depression.
Postpartum depression.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's it's everywhere. Oh gosh, there's so much to say about pregnancy and about the things from as well when we talk about symptoms around pregnancy, whether that's around menstruation, about getting pregnant, about what you experience during pregnancy, but also after pregnancy. We see it everywhere in midwives' manuals, but also in surgeons' manuals, in doctors, because they're trying to help the women, they're trying to solve what's happening. And we often also, for example, when it comes to postpartum depression, we also see this pop up, for instance, in court cases, where something has happened to the infant, and it has to be decided whether the mother has killed the child or whether it was a stillborn child, and then the mental state of the woman gets taken into account. So yeah, short answer, it's everywhere in history, and there's a lot of research, because of course it's very important the men are doing most of the research when we look at science in the pre-modern period. They want to have healthy children, and they want their women to be okay. So there's a lot of research on how can we make pregnancy safer, and especially the delivery is safe, go as safely as possible so that the woman and the child survive. So there's a lot of course, it's not always called the same with postpartum depression. I don't think we've seen the term. I think it's quite a recent
very
term,
modern
I would
term.
say. But that women go through different stages after they give birth. That's definitely realized, or it's in the books as well. Yeah.
Well, I think your example of the criminal cases, that's a very good one. Eh? So if you go to court and almost every woman who was standing up in court accused of some crime, a doctor was called in to comment on her menstrual patterns. So he would look at her menstruation, whether it was regular or irregular, and irregular patterns could always sort of excuse her crime. Eh? So it was very often also used as an excuse. Or would plead her free from whatever she had done, apart from when she killed her child. I think that was...
yeah, but also there it's the physical state of women were... These were court cases which you might not think are an important source for the history of medicine or the female body. There it turns up a lot, because she often gets a physical examination when she's accused of a crime. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I have a question about how you conduct research, especially when looking at medical research from the past. So, for example, the fact that probably most of the research you encountered was written by men. How do you address this bias? And based on what you recently said, I imagine you would say that the fact that medical research is written by men, this could be useful to see what is missing from research regarding the female body. Would you agree with this, or how do you, in general, address this bias?
So this is an interesting story for me, because when I did my PhD, I wrote a book about a Dutch thinker, a male thinker, who was banished for his ideas on sexuality. And when I was talking about the book then, people always ask me, so as a woman, don't you think you should look at women in history? And I would always be a bit offended. I'm like, yeah, but I study science before 1800. There are no women. And then I read a book by Catherine Park, The Secrets of Women. And she's actually like, well, women are everywhere. Even though they are not writing the books, women are everywhere in those books. And this really opened my eyes to look at my sources differently. And then I discovered women everywhere, because they're on the dissection tables, they're in the patient stories, they're through the work of these men you can find a lot of women, and you can see a lot of women's stories if you read the sources differently. So that's one answer. But also you look at different sources. So we don't just read the scientific stories, we don't just read the doctors, we also read the midwives' books. We read the female letters, we read the female ego documents. So you have to not just look at formal science before 1800, you have to also look at different sources to address that bias. And you have to look differently, because I was still very much educated in a system where it was, well, you look at the men, you look at the published works, you look at the big names, and that's where you find the knowledge about history. And now, the last 10, 20 years, we are learning, now we actually read those sources differently and address it differently, yeah.
Yes, and it has very recently also been suggested that many of the male books, or so-called male books, were very much sort of suggested by women. So all these male midwives of the 18th century, of course they didn't know anything by experience about the female body, so they relied very much on the information they got from midwives. So also there we see the female voice, even though it's written down by a male writer. It asks for a bit of reading against the grain, but they are everywhere, the women.
Yeah, thankfully, even though we would have loved to have more women, obviously. But
I wanted to ask more about the historical context. So you separate in these pre-modern times and then everything 18th century onwards as some clear distinction between like how women were treated. So I was curious, what was exactly a contextual change at the time that pushed people more towards that patriarchal system and seeing males maybe as a more superior? And how does this still play today, in your opinion?
I think the easy answer is the French Revolution. The French Revolution is always your answer to everything. So during the French Revolution, all the old systems were abolished. So also the old medical system and the old hospitals. So for a while, people did without doctors and without hospitals, but then they started to discover that this didn't really work, and a lot of soldiers died on the battlefield. So they needed a new medical system, and that is when they started to establish new hospitals, and they are actually the basis of our modern hospitals. So we get hospitals based on the pathology of the patients, with special wards for lung diseases or heart diseases or gynecological wards. We also get big research laboratories. We didn't have them before. And that is also the time when gynecology became a discipline. And in this whole making of a discipline, that's a very 19th century development. We haven't seen it really before. The gynecologists had to emancipate themselves from the surgeons, but they also had to push away the midwives, who also had a claim to the female body. And in doing that, they started doing these very technical operations, which are of course very artistically done, and they could show off their skills. So that is very much a 19th century development, which could take place because all the old systems were abolished. So that is, for a very long time, that was the view in history of medicine. There is a big seizure with the French Revolution. Of course, this is a very neat explanation, and reality was far more complex. And we see that all the old ideas are still sort of in the undercurrent and are still somewhere there. So we have the horrible hospitals, and we have the horrible doctors doing ovariotomies. But we also have doctors who are doing this more holistic medicine and who are arguing against it and who are standing more in the old traditions.
And of course, this change was prepared by scientific developments, enlightenment, things that already started in the 17th century, because the clean break was to establish something new. These ideas were already there 50, 100 years before developing, but because of the clean break, you could kind of start anew. Because of the French Revolution, but things like pathology and new ideas of thinking about science, the humors becoming less important, etc.
And so Napoleon was important. So Napoleon, he made a lot of regulations also for medicine, and in particular also for gynecology, because Napoleon, he needed a lot of men for his armies, so he needed women to be very productive. So gynecology was very high up on his agenda, and he was always talking about female machines, baby machines, but that made gynecology a very important discipline.
Any books we can read about this shift in this medicalization? I was thinking, doesn't Foucault write about this in his books, about the way we medicalize things and that the system then controls?
Yes, Foucault, he writes about the medical gaze, and that is very much about the 19th century, that we started looking at the patients in hospitals as patients, not as people, but as patients. And we looked more at their disease than at their person. And so the lung on ward 34 or room 34, that is very much like, it's Foucaultian, but it's also very 19th century. But I also think that the way Foucault has written it down has very much influenced our thinking about this, and has maybe made that we haven't seen enough of the undercurrents, which we should maybe, huh?
Okay, it's about time. 9:30. Nice ending. I thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I did really like the kitchen table thing. And I wish you good luck with all your work. And I think it's very interesting to have this historical view, because it's underlying how we think about things nowadays, and does tell us a little bit about the gap that's still there. It is getting better, although you're getting worried about what changes in society. Trump, yeah, that effect. But thank you very much for coming. Thank you all. Hope to see you back at other lectures of Stumpf.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.